Can we prove the existence of God by reason alone? Descartes opens the meditations with a wild experiment. Doubt everything: the world, other people, the senses, even reason itself. And in doing so, reality is left with basically nothing. Can I be certain about anything when everything else is falling apart? Regardless of whether everything is false, at least one thing is true: he is thinking. And since he is thinking, he exists. That becomes the foundation from which he tries to rebuild knowledge. In this episode, we will break down meditations 3 to 6, where our ideas originate, why we tend to make mistakes, whether mathematics can really be trusted, can we prove the existence of God by reason alone, and finally, the age-old question: are you your body or are you something that is using it? Descartes has eliminated every aspect of external experience. No sensory input, no distractions, no outside stimuli. Only himself and his thoughts. There is only one thing he finds. He thinks, that's it. He doubts, he imagines, he wants, he fears. All of those things happen. Therefore, he exists as a thinking being. Everything else is negotiable. This is not. So if I am certain I exist because I think, what makes that certainty possible? His response is clear and distinct perception. When you are clearly able to think about something without any ambiguity, then you will certainly know it, or at least you will feel like you do, which is a very different thing. We've all been extremely confident about many things, only to realize that they were totally incorrect. Many people were extremely confident that the sun revolved around the earth. Descartes is developing a rule for what constitutes knowledge, but he is aware that it may not always hold up. Then he develops a problem. Not only can he doubt physical objects such as chairs and tables, he can also doubt mathematical concepts. For example, if someone told him 2 plus 2 is 4, he would ask why. Maybe, he says, even the most obvious truths could be misread if a higher power made you that way, because it is hard to imagine a life filled with that much uncertainty. You look at your watch, it says 2:30, but perhaps it really isn't. Perhaps your perceptions are slightly distorted. You would lose your sanity in that scenario. Therefore, Descartes states that in order to develop a foundation for any type of knowledge, he needs to answer 2 questions. First, does God exist? Second, if God exists, can God possibly deceive me? Now we enter the core of meditation 3, the origin of ideas. Descartes identifies 2 types of thoughts. One is an image. This includes, for instance, picturing a tree or a dragon. The other is a judgment. This includes making a statement such as, this is real or that is fake. Thoughts themselves are not false. So if you picture a unicorn, that is not a lie. You are imagining it. That part is accurate. But where do ideas originate? Because if you don't know where your thoughts come from, you don't really know what to trust. Descartes says your ideas come from 3 places. Some ideas are innately within us. Very Socratic approach here. But some ideas are derived from our surroundings. For example, the flame on a candle producing heat. And finally, some ideas are generated by our imagination. For example, flying horse or unicorn. Just because an idea appears to be derived from outside your head, it does not necessarily mean that it was. Dreams appear to be real. Hallucinations appear to be real. Your brain can create entire worlds without obtaining permission from the actual world. And the scariest part, it doesn't even label them as fake. Even if an idea does originate from outside your head, how do you know that your representation of the idea accurately represents the actual object itself? Consider the sun. To the naked eye, the sun appears small. Scientifically, the sun is enormous. So at the end of the day, which idea is correct? The one provided by your senses or the one provided through rationalization? Here, he proposes the concept of degrees of reality. Some ideas represent simple objects, such as a rock. Other ideas represent more complicated or greater objects, such as a person. And if we increase the complexity, then we end up with the idea of God, infinite, perfect, all-powerful. An idea cannot originate from void. In addition, an idea cannot contain greater reality than its source. To provide an analogy using a modern concept, for example, a high definition movie contains high levels of detail. It had to have originated from a camera or system that produced similar quality. So Descartes applies this concept to the mind as well. If you have an idea of something infinite and perfect, such as God, that idea had to have originated from something that is actually infinite and perfect. Since you, as a finite being, do not possess sufficient reality to produce such an idea yourself. So, but can we really say that we cannot form ideas greater than ourselves? Consider the following. We can imagine perfect circles, but we will never find a perfect circle in nature. We can imagine infinity in mathematics, but we will never directly experience it. We can imagine fictionally created worlds in video games that are more detailed than anything we have personally experienced. So, is it really true that we cannot construct larger ideas from smaller parts? He argues that the idea of God is not simply a combination or a mashup of smaller ideas. Rather, it is full, rich, and perfect. It contains all perfections, infinite knowledge, infinite power, etc. And he claims that this could not have originated from a limited being such as himself. Even though an idea seems large, does not mean that it requires a larger source, however. Humans tend to be capable of taking a small idea and stretching it into something larger. For example, you see this in social media. A person may live a relatively ordinary life, yet their social media page depicts them living a perfect life. So perhaps the idea of gods is simply an exaggerated form of human characteristics. Thus, knowledge becoming all knowledge, power becoming all powerful, goodness becoming perfect goodness. Descartes, however, disputes this. He states that he understands the concept of the infinite prior to understanding the concept of the finite. He knows that he is imperfect because he compares himself to a perfect entity, alternative idea. But here's an alternative idea. Maybe we invent perfection and with that the idea of God because we are tired of our limits. Even if we try to get rid of the idea of God from equation, we can still never get rid of the idea of perfection. Think of Nietzsche and how he presented the idea of Übermensch or Superman as an ultimate solution to the problem of nihilism after the dramatic death of God. So Nietzsche kills the God, but he still reaches for transcendence in another form. So the question remains, where does that ideal come from? The idea of perfection and associating it with God is an interesting statement. Do we really begin with perfection, or do we identify our limitations and then begin to conceptualize what it would be like to have no limitations? Descartes claims that the idea of God is clear and distinct. In fact, it is clearer and more distinct than any other idea. Due to its clarity and distinctiveness, it must be true. Therefore, it must be the case that God exists, according to Descartes. It goes from I have an idea of perfection to perfection must exist. But here's a challenge. Having an idea does not automatically equate to existing. One can have a very clear and distinct idea of a perfect society, for example, but having that idea does not mean that a perfect society currently exists somewhere. Descartes foresees this as an objection to his argument for the existence of God. Perhaps I could have developed these perfections over time myself as a person. Perhaps I'm simply becoming better, educated, wiser, and improving. But ultimately, he states no. Even if you continue to improve indefinitely, you will never actually achieve infinity. There will always be areas in which you lack. So you will never become Übermensch. And God, by definition, lacks nothing. God is completely perfect, with no potentiality, no incompleteness, according to Descartes. Therefore, he concludes that the origin of this idea must be something that is already perfectly complete. He then poses another question. Did I create myself? If I did, he states that you would give yourself all the perfections. You would not leave gaps. You would not leave yourself uncertain, ignorant, or prone to error. If he had that capability, he would certainly utilize it. Thus, he concludes that I did not create myself, something else did. And whatever that something is, it must possess at least as much reality as I do. Furthermore, it must be the source of this idea of perfection, and thus he arrives once again at God. But just because we do not have total control over ourselves does not necessarily imply that a perfect being has control. It may be that we are the product of imperfect process, evolution, random chance, biology. So Descartes does not entertain these possibilities, at least not in a modern sense. Lastly, he posits that God must have placed this idea of perfection in him, similar to an artist leaving a signature on a painting. But if God is perfect and God created me, then why am I so capable of being wrong? Why do I say stupid things, accept weak arguments, trust questionable people, purchase items I don't need, and then get shocked later as if I was the victim of the universe? Why a good and perfect God created such an imperfect creature? If God is not a deceiver, then where does error originate? Descartes states that the source of error is not the fact that God gave us a flawed brain. The issue lies in the gap between understanding and will. My understanding is limited. I do not know everything. In fact, I know very little, but my will is large in comparison. I can agree to nearly anything. I can evaluate, select, approve, disapprove, marry, divorce, invest, accuse, defend, etc. All before I fully comprehend what I am doing. So error comes from the will outrunning the understanding. Someone sees one headline, watches one 30-second video, and suddenly believes himself to be an expert in war, medicine, economics, child rearing, nutrition, and possibly the Roman Empire. We have limited knowledge, but we have an abundance of confidence. This is the entire tragedy because most people would rather feel certain than be right. Many poor decision making choices are due to having some knowledge combined with complete confidence. That is a lethal combination. Not I know nothing, but I know enough, which is usually the phrase we say right before we humiliate ourselves. And maybe it is a good time to also insert Nietzsche here, who lived far long after Descartes. And actually, Nietzsche criticized that intellectual component more and emphasized the will to power as a driving force. As he writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the falseness of a judgment is for us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. It is here perhaps that our new language sounds most strangely. The question is to what extent it is life promoting, life preserving, species preserving, perhaps even species cultivating. Even so, I do not believe Descartes escapes with a free pass here. He claims that the origin of error is our own fault because we judge outside of what we clearly understand. Okay, but life does not always provide us with the luxury of having complete and distinct knowledge. Sometimes you are forced to make a choice using incomplete data. You are required to hire a job, trust a partner, vote, relocate, express yourself, or remain silent, all while the facts are unclear. So the notion that we should only judge when the circumstances are perfectly transparent sounds good in philosophy, but human existence is usually messier than that. But the ultimate argument that Descartes posits here is that when clarity is absent, confidence should be diminished. And when we make errors, it is not because that God provided us with a flawed brain, but it is because our confidence is higher than what our current knowledge requires. Simply implementing that idea alone would significantly enhance the state of society. Imagine if people stated, I could be mistaken more frequently. The world would immediately become less crazy. What Descartes says about overconfidence is equally important. The real problem with our minds isn't that they are weak and they're flawed. It is that we don't limit ourselves. We can pause, we can wait, we can say, I don't know, but we can't stand that. Most people prefer to give a wrong answer than to sit in confusion for 10 seconds. Because being uncertain makes us feel embarrassed. Feeling confident makes us feel strong, even if the confidence is false or based on false knowledge. So most people would rather have the feeling of being truthful than be truthful. Truth is quiet, confidence is loud. Guess which one wins online and gets the most attention these days? In Meditation 5, Descartes provides an additional justification for the existence of God. If you thought the first one wasn't enough already, he states, look, when I consider God, I'm thinking of a supremely perfect being. And if God is a supremely perfect being, then existence must belong to God, since existing is more perfect than not existing. Thus, if I truly understand what God is, I cannot isolate God's existence from his existence. Therefore, God exists. It sounds so clever, but also maybe a bit too clever. So just because you include existence within your definition of something, that does not mean that thing exists in reality. I can define my ideal apartment as having sunlight, low rent, no noisy neighbors, and a landlord who responds to messages, but that does not create the ideal apartment by itself. Descartes knows this counterargument and he understands it, so he claims that God is different. A mountain can be imagined as being surrounded by a valley, sure, but that doesn't imply that mountains exist. God is unique in that existence is part of God's very nature. You cannot think of God without including existence, according to Descartes. You cannot think of a triangle without three sides. Same logic. So the leap from I must think of God in this manner to God therefore exists is quite enormous here. In Meditation 6, this is where Descartes will begin the rebuilding process of the world that he destroyed. After doubting the senses, doubting the body, and doubting the outside world, and spending a great deal of time in solitude with his own thoughts, Descartes wishes to obtain some answers. Do material things exist? Is the body real? What is the relationship between the mind and the body? He begins with a relatively minor point. Material things at least appear to be possible. Why? Because he can clearly think about them mathematically. Shape, size, motion, extension. Even though the senses are untrustworthy, geometric forms remain trustworthy. A square does not turn into a triangle simply because your mood changes. So he states that bodies can exist because God can create anything that can be clearly conceived. He then adds an additional insight concerning imagination. He argues that imagination is not merely a product of pure thinking. He is able to both think of and visualize a triangle. At the same time, he's also able to think of a thousand-sided polygon, but he cannot truly imagine all of its sides within his mind. In this manner, imagination is less powerful than pure thinking. He claims that in everyday life, he normally accepted that he had a body, that other bodies existed, and that the things outside of himself caused this sensation: pain, hunger, thirst, pleasure, color, sound, heat. All of these appeared to come from things external to his mind. Moreover, he did not choose to have hunger, so no one plans a migraine at 3 p.m. just to add excitement to their day. However, Descartes also recalls why he was skeptical of the senses to begin with. Towers appear circular from far away and square when viewed up close. Dreams can feel as realistic as actual experiences. The senses provide information, but they can also deceive you. Since God is not a deceiver, that's something that we established before, and since he has a strong natural inclination to believe that the sensory ideas of the existence of bodies arise from bodies, Descartes believes that material objects must also exist. Not exactly how they appear through sensation, though, since colors, flavors, and heat may not accurately reflect reality, but bodies exist at least as extended objects in space. So Descartes does not claim that the senses provide us with an accurate view of the world. So the world is there, objects are there, but our senses sometimes deceive us. So that's the main argument here. Because your senses are built to keep you alive and not tell you the truth. They are more akin to a survival application rather than a truth application. This is the true distinction between mind and body, famous dualism of Descartes. Descartes says, I am capable of conceiving myself as a thinking substance. Remember the meditation 1 and 2? So you are able to conceive yourself as a thinking substance. And I'm also capable of conceiving a body as an extended substance without thought. So the mind and body are distinct. The mind is not the body. The self is not reducible to the flesh. Modern debate still continues to wrestle with these questions. Are you your brain, or is consciousness merely neural activity? Would you be you if we were able to perfectly duplicate your brain in a machine? Or would that simply be a really, really creepy cousin of yours, made of metal and electricity? Descartes would argue that there is a distinction between the thinking self and the material, where the application of your mind is located. The body may be divisible. The mind, on the other hand, does not appear to come in parts. So if you remove your foot, you will not lose a portion of your mind. The body has parts. The mind, as mind, does not seem to have parts. Even when you are confused, distracted, or tired, you are still one self, one mind, just a little worse on battery, maybe. So if the mind and body are truly separate, then how do they communicate? In other words, how does a non material mind move a physical arm? What is the meeting place between the two? Descartes states that the mind is closely linked to the body, particularly through the brain. I am not within my body in the way a pilot is in a ship. I am not some detached driver who sits behind the eyes with a steering wheel. I am part of the body. When the body is injured, I do not simply observe the damage, like a mechanic reading a report. I feel it. Descartes is frequently criticized for separating the mind and the body too sharply, but actually, the Descartes also emphasizes the extent to which they are connected in experience. You are not simply located within a body, you live as this mind body mixture. Nature teaches us useful things. Pain warns us to avoid danger. Hunger instructs us to eat. Generally, these signals are accurate, yet not always. There are times when the system fails. A sick person wants to engage in behavior that will harm themselves, for example. A thirst might occur at a time when a drinking will worsen the matters. Therefore, nature can lead us astray. And in that context, now the modern question becomes more acute. If our subjective experience is dependent upon signals and processing, then what constitutes a mind? If a machine could accept input, process those inputs, report its internal state, adapt, remember, speak about itself, would that constitute a mind for artificial intelligence in the future? I believe Descartes would likely dispute that. He would say that matter is extended and lacks thought. Thought resides in the mind, not the body. Thus, no matter how sophisticated a machine is, it would remain mechanical, not conscious. But honestly, I'm not certain if it is that simple. If a system acts in ways that demonstrate understanding, reflects, doubts, learns, develops a coherent perspective, dismissing it too quickly may simply repeat an earlier mistake by assuming that mind must resemble humans in order to qualify. Descartes tried to separate the mind from the body, but in experience, they refused to stay apart. And maybe that tension is the point. You are not just a body, you are not just a mind. You are the problem of trying to be both. Thank you for listening or watching. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, you can follow the show on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Please consider leaving a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the show reach a lot of people. You can also leave comments if you have any personal thoughts on the topics discussed during the episodes. More conversations and solo episodes are on the way in the following weeks, and following the show is the best way to be notified about them. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can DM me on Instagram at philosophy.everyday. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.